In the waning years of the 19th century, Arkansas was a land caught between tradition and change. The Civil War had ended more than 2 decades before, but its scars remained, etched into the soil, the politics, and the people. Small farming communities dotted the countryside, each bound tightly by kinship, religion, and the unspoken codes of honor that governed daily life. It was in this world of horse-drawn wagons, clapboard churches, and dusty rural roads that our story begins. A story so shocking that it reverberated far beyond the county lines where it first took place. In 1888, when the rest of America was busy with industrial expansion, railroad building, and the promise of modernity, Arkansas found itself the stage for a deeply personal scandal. A father betraying his own son by taking the young man's bride for himself. This was no ordinary family quarrel, but a violation of sacred trust that would test the very fabric of a community's moral foundation. To fully grasp the weight of what happened, one must first understand the importance of marriage in the 1880s South. Marriage was not simply a personal contract between two individuals. It was a covenant blessed by God, sanctioned by the community, and often bound by economic necessity. A union meant stability, the joining of families, and the continuation of tradition. When two young people became engaged, their courtship was watched closely, and their vows were considered an extension of the values that held the town together. To interfere with this sacred process was to risk not only personal shame but also communal wrath. And yet, against this backdrop of sanctity, a forbidden act unfolded, an act that made a mockery of both divine and civil law. Rumors in rural towns often spread faster than wildfire, and by 1888, whispers began to circulate in hushed tones at church gatherings and in the marketplace. At first, the story was too outrageous to believe. That a father, respected in age and status, had developed a secret interest in his son's betrothed. Gossip soon turned to shock when the impossible became reality. The young man, full of expectation for his upcoming marriage, was forced to watch as his bride was taken by the very man he trusted most. Betrayal of this magnitude was unheard of, and the community's outrage grew not just out of sympathy for the son, but out of fear that such a precedent could unravel the moral order itself. The tale of the forbidden marriage in Arkansas is more than just a family tragedy. It is a window into the values, fears, and contradictions of late 19th century America. It illustrates how power, patriarchy, and social expectations could collide in ways that left the vulnerable with no defense. It also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human desire, weakness, and betrayal. By exploring this scandal, we do not merely retell an old piece of gossip. We uncover a narrative that speaks to timeless questions. How far will people go to satisfy forbidden urges? What happens when trust between father and son collapses? And how does a community respond when its most sacred bonds are broken? As we step deeper into the story, we will see how this single act of betrayal left ripples that echoed through lives, laws, and legacies. The Arkansas of 1888 was a world defined by contrast. On one hand, the state was still largely rural, dependent on farming and small-town commerce. Families lived off the land, raising cotton, corn, and livestock, their livelihoods bound tightly to the cycles of nature. On the other hand, railroads were beginning to carve through the countryside, linking once isolated towns to larger markets and bringing with them hints of progress and modernization. Yet despite these outward signs of change, social life remained stubbornly conservative. Churches were the centers of both worship and authority, with sermons shaping not only spiritual beliefs but also community values. Respectability, honor, and family reputation mattered above all. Within this setting, marriages were not only personal unions but also community events, each one reflecting the moral fabric of society. It was against this deeply traditional background that the scandal of a father taking his son's bride erupted, a violation so severe it clashed with the very identity of the place and time. Marriage in late 19th century Arkansas was as much about practicality as it was about romance. Families often looked to unions as opportunities to strengthen ties, pool resources, or secure economic stability. Engagements were public matters, often announced in church or through word of mouth, and any disruption was viewed with alarm. The bride was expected to embody purity and obedience, while the groom was tasked with providing stability and honor to his household. Fathers, meanwhile, were guardians of these traditions, ensuring that daughters were married properly and sons upheld the family name. For a father to disregard these expectations and claim his son's bride was to invert the entire social order. It was not simply a private scandal but a public betrayal, one that undermined the unwritten codes upon which communities relied. Religion in Arkansas during this period was more than a Sunday ritual. It was the heartbeat of daily life. The church dictated what was right and wrong, providing moral boundaries that extended into courtship, marriage, and family life. Ministers preached fiery sermons about sin, fidelity, and the sanctity of marriage, often citing scripture to reinforce these ideals. Communities believed that straying from these principles invited divine punishment, not just upon the guilty party but upon everyone associated with them. In this deeply religious atmosphere, the act of a father marrying his son's intended was nothing less than a spiritual calamity. It was considered an affront to God, a tearing apart of sacred vows before they could even be spoken. The scandal was not simply about human betrayal. It was about defying the laws of both heaven and earth. The legal framework of the late 19th century added yet another layer of complexity to the scandal. Marriage laws varied by state, and in Arkansas, as elsewhere, age of consent and parental rights often created loopholes that could be exploited. Fathers had significant authority over family decisions, particularly in rural communities where official oversight was limited. Courthouses were distant, records were poorly kept, and many marriages were conducted under the watchful eyes of ministers rather than legal authorities. This made it possible, in rare but devastating cases, for individuals to manipulate the system to their advantage. When the father in our story took his son's bride, he may have relied on these ambiguities, legal gray areas that allowed him to cloak his betrayal in the thin veil of legitimacy. Yet no law could shield him from the condemnation of the community, whose judgment was often harsher and longer lasting than any court ruling. At the heart of this scandal lies the figure of the son, a young man who, like many of his generation, dreamed of building a life rooted in family, faith, and hard work. In 1888 Arkansas, young men often took on responsibilities early, laboring in fields, learning trades, and preparing to take their place as heads of households. For him, securing a bride meant not only companionship but also the fulfillment of his role as provider and protector. Accounts describe him as earnest, perhaps naive, but deeply committed to the woman he loved. His engagement was a source of pride, the promise of stability in a world that offered little certainty. Yet this same pride would be shattered in a way few could imagine. His own father, the man he admired and obeyed, would betray him in the most intimate of ways. The son's pain was not only the loss of his bride but the collapse of trust within the very relationship that was supposed to be his foundation. The father, central to this tragedy, was a man shaped by the rigid expectations of his era. Older, respected, and accustomed to deference, he embodied the authority that patriarchs held in Southern households. Widowed or estranged from his wife, accounts differ. He may have been vulnerable to loneliness, yet he also wielded significant power over his family. To outsiders, he appeared a man of responsibility, perhaps stern but respectable. But beneath this facade lurked desires and impulses that he either could not, or chose not to, control. His decision to claim his son's bride was not a moment of weakness but a calculated act that disregarded both familial loyalty and social convention. Some may have seen it as lust, others as an assertion of dominance, but to the community, it was an unpardonable breach of duty. His authority, once the pillar of the household, became the very instrument of its destruction. The young bride stood at the center of this scandal, not as a schemer but as someone caught in an impossible web. Women in 1888 Arkansas had limited agency. Marriage often dictated their futures, leaving them little room to resist the pressures of family and society. Her engagement to the son had promised a familiar path, a modest home, children, and a respected place in the community. Yet when the father asserted himself, her choices narrowed drastically. Was she coerced, persuaded, or manipulated? Did she see in the father a more secure future? Or was she simply unable to resist the authority he represented? The historical record leaves her motives unclear, but one truth is undeniable. she bore the heaviest burden. Whether seen as a victim of power or complicit in the betrayal, she became the symbol of scandal, her reputation forever tied to the forbidden marriage that shook her community to its core. No family exists in isolation, and in 1888 Arkansas, the eyes of the community were always watching. Neighbors gossiped over fences, congregants whispered in church pews, and shopkeepers speculated about every rumor that drifted down Main Street. When news of the forbidden marriage spread, outrage was immediate and unforgiving. For them, this was not merely a private dispute. It was a threat to the moral order that held their society together. They judged the father as a corrupter, the son as a tragic figure, and the bride as either weak or wayward. Yet behind the whispers lay genuine fear. If such betrayal could happen in a respected household, what did it mean for everyone else? Community condemnation, often harsher than legal punishment, became the true sentence handed down. The family was not only fractured internally but also cast out socially, forced to live under the shadow of a scandal that would never fade from memory. In the quiet rhythms of 1880s Arkansas life, courtship was one of the few occasions that stirred excitement in otherwise predictable days. The son's pursuit of his bride followed the well-worn path of rural romance. Sunday meetings at church, chaperoned visits, and long conversations on porches beneath oil lamps that glowed faintly against the southern night sky. To the community, their relationship seemed pure and promising. She was admired for her modesty and charm. He, for his earnestness and hard-working spirit. Their affection blossomed into an engagement that promised to unite not only two individuals but also their families. The father, outwardly supportive, appeared to bless this union like any patriarch would. Yet beneath his nods of approval and polite smiles lingered a silence no one could read. The son believed he was building a future, never suspecting that his father, standing quietly in the background, was nurturing a desire that would eventually turn his dreams into ashes. Engagements in rural Arkansas were as much a communal matter as a personal one. The announcement sparked a flurry of activity. Families exchanged visits, church elders offered blessings, and neighbors prepared to celebrate what promised to be a joyful occasion. Simple though it was, the planning of a wedding carried enormous weight. The bride's family worked to sew garments and gather small luxuries for her new household. The groom's family readied their land and home for the responsibilities of marriage. And above all, the church played a guiding role, reminding the couple of the sacred vows that would soon bind them together before God and neighbor alike. In these preparations, the son poured his energy with pride, eager to prove his worth as a future husband. He could not imagine that all his hopes, the carefully chosen gifts, the whispered promises of devotion, the dreams of children yet unborn, were on the verge of being stolen not by a stranger, but by his own blood. Even in the midst of joy, subtle signs of tension began to emerge. Observant neighbors later recalled how the father lingered too long in conversation with the bride, how his eyes betrayed a restless energy whenever she entered a room. Some dismissed these moments as harmless gestures of paternal concern, while others whispered suspicions behind closed doors. The bride, caught in the attention of both father and son, appeared nervous at times, her gaze shifting uneasily as if she carried a secret she dared not speak aloud. The son, blinded by love, overlooked the unease. He trusted his father completely, never imagining betrayal. Yet the signs, faint though they were, suggested that the harmony of the engagement was fragile. Beneath the surface of festive preparations, a silent struggle was unfolding. A struggle between duty and desire, loyalty and temptation, that threatened to unravel everything before vows could even be spoken. As the engagement reached its peak, the community gathered to celebrate the couple's impending union. At church gatherings and social events, their love was praised as an example of youthful devotion, a beacon of stability in uncertain times. The son, filled with pride, made heartfelt promises to cherish and protect his bride for life. The bride, whether with genuine conviction or under unspoken pressure, returned those vows with quiet resolve. Even the father, standing beside them, seemed to bless their future with solemn approval. But history often records that the brightest moments of joy can cast the darkest shadows. What none could predict was that this engagement, the symbol of innocence and hope, would become the stage for betrayal so profound that it would scar reputations and break hearts for generations. The promise of love, celebrated so publicly, was destined to collapse under the weight of secrecy and forbidden desire. The wedding that should have united the son and his beloved never took place. Instead, whispers spread like wildfire through the community. The father had stepped forward, not as a witness to his son's vows, but as the groom himself. In a stunning reversal, the young woman who was meant to be the son's bride became his stepmother. For many, the news was so unthinkable that they dismissed it as gossip at first, until confirmation came from those who had attended the quiet, hastily arranged ceremony. The church bells that should have celebrated youthful love now tolled with a bitter irony, announcing a union that inverted the natural order. To marry a woman promised to one's own child was not merely a private choice. It was a public violation of trust, morality, and decency. The father had crossed a line few even dared to imagine, leaving his son humiliated, betrayed, and stripped of the future he had been promised. For the son, the betrayal was devastating. It was not simply the loss of a bride, though that pain alone was enough to shatter his heart. It was the collapse of every foundation upon which he had built his life. A father was meant to protect, to guide, to pass down wisdom and strength. Instead, his own father had taken from him the very person he loved most, leaving him with a wound that no words of consolation could heal. Friends spoke of his silence, how his once bright demeanor turned grim, how he avoided gatherings where curious eyes searched his face for signs of despair. He could not escape the pity of the community, nor the whispers that followed him wherever he went. To live under the shadow of such betrayal was a punishment in itself. His future, once full of promise, now seemed stripped bare, leaving only bitterness in place of hope. The role of the bride in this betrayal remains clouded in mystery. Some believed she was coerced, pressured by the father's authority and the limited options available to women in that era. Others whispered that she had been swayed by promises of stability, protection, or perhaps even a forbidden attraction. Whatever her reasons, her decision forever marked her in the eyes of the community. She was no longer the innocent young woman preparing for her first marriage. She was now seen as a participant in a scandal that betrayed the son and disgraced the family. Whether she felt trapped or complicit, her fate was sealed. Every glance in town, every whispered remark, carried the weight of judgment. In marrying the father, she gained a husband, but she lost her standing, her reputation, and perhaps even her peace of mind. Her life became entwined with a choice that history would remember as both shocking and tragic. No betrayal of this magnitude could remain confined to a single household. The scandal exploded across Arkansas, becoming the subject of sermons, gossip, and outrage. Neighbors who once respected the father now spoke his name with disgust, calling him a corrupter and a man unworthy of trust. The church, the central pillar of the community, struggled to reconcile such a violation with its teachings. How could vows spoken under God carry any legitimacy when they were rooted in such betrayal? Some called for legal action, though the ambiguities of marriage law left little room for intervention. Others argued that social punishment would suffice, and indeed the family was ostracized, shunned by those who once shared meals and prayers with them. The betrayal had not only broken a son's heart, but also fractured the trust of an entire community. In their eyes, this was not simply a family scandal, it was a moral catastrophe. When news of the forbidden marriage spread, many in the community demanded justice. Surely such an act, they thought, must be against the law. Yet when elders and church leaders sought legal guidance, they discovered the uncomfortable truth. The statutes of Arkansas in 1888 were murky. There were prohibitions against incest, but the law did not clearly define a father marrying a son's fiancée as such. Age of consent, parental authority, and vague marriage codes created a gray area that allowed the union to stand. Judges and county officials, reluctant to wade into what they considered a domestic matter, often turned a blind eye. The father exploited these ambiguities, cloaking his betrayal in the semblance of legality. To the son, this was salt on the wound. Not only had his bride been stolen, but the law itself offered no remedy. In the eyes of the court, nothing had been broken. But in the eyes of the community, everything had been destroyed. If the law was silent, the church was not. Ministers thundered from pulpits, condemning the union as an abomination before God. Marriage, they declared, was sacred, and this twisted bond mocked the very sacrament itself. Congregations whispered furiously, struggling to reconcile the image of a respected patriarch with the sin of betrayal. Some parishes refused to recognize the marriage at all, treating the couple as if they lived in perpetual sin. The father and his new wife found themselves unwelcome at services, shunned not only by neighbors but by the very institution that gave spiritual legitimacy to marriage. This religious condemnation carried enormous weight. In rural Arkansas, to be cast out of the church was to lose one's place in the community. Without spiritual belonging, the couple's union was branded not as holy matrimony but as a public disgrace. Their names became synonymous with shame, repeated in sermons as cautionary examples of moral collapse. For the betrayed son, the aftermath was as cruel as the betrayal itself. His humiliation was public, his heartbreak a subject of gossip in every store, farm, and church gathering. Some pitied him while others, cruelly, mocked his misfortune, calling him weak for failing to prevent the union. He withdrew from the community, unable to endure the constant stares and whispered judgments. Accounts suggest he may have left town entirely, seeking to rebuild his life far from the shadow of his father's scandal. But even in distance, the wound traveled with him. The betrayal was not just the loss of a woman. It was the loss of trust, family, and identity. In a culture where manhood was measured by honor and respect, his father had stripped him of both, leaving scars that time could never fully heal. He became, in the memory of the town, the tragic victim of a sin that defied comprehension. The forbidden marriage did not merely wound individuals, it destroyed an entire family. Relatives split in loyalty. Some condemned the father outright, while others, bound by blood, kept silent, torn between outrage and obligation. Holiday gatherings dissolved into bitterness. Kinship ties unraveled under the weight of scandal. The bride, now the father's wife, lived in constant tension, surrounded by whispers and isolation. The father himself, once a figure of authority, became a man defined by shame, his reputation forever stained. What had begun as a promise of union ended as a tale of division so deep it fractured generations. The family name, once respected, was now a curse, spoken in hushed tones as a warning. And yet, perhaps the most enduring tragedy was not the gossip or the judgment, but the silence left in its wake. A silence where love should have grown, where trust should have endured, and where family should have remained whole. The scandal of 1888 was more than a family drama. It was a raw display of patriarchal power in its most destructive form. In a society where fathers were revered as heads of households and final arbiters of family decisions, the father in this story used his authority not to protect, but to exploit. His act revealed how power, when unchecked, could twist familial duty into personal gain. The son's obedience and respect, qualities expected of him, became the very tools of his undoing. The bride's vulnerability, shaped by a culture that gave women little say in their futures, left her with no shield against his dominance. In this betrayal, we see not only the tragedy of three individuals but the dangerous imbalance of a system where power was concentrated in the hands of one man. It forces us to question, how many other silent betrayals were buried under the weight of patriarchal authority? Honor was the bedrock of Southern society in the late 19th century, shaping how men carried themselves, how families interacted, and how communities maintained order. Yet the Arkansas scandal demonstrated how fragile that honor truly was. A single act could destroy reputations built over decades, erasing respect with one stroke of betrayal. For the son, the loss of honor was catastrophic. His manhood questioned, his worth diminished. For the father, his decision revealed that even men who were supposed to be guardians of virtue could crumble under temptation. The bride, too, bore the brunt of this fragility. Her perceived loss of purity and loyalty branded her in ways from which she could never recover. The entire community saw in this scandal a reminder that honor, though prized above all, was precarious, always at risk of being shattered by hidden desires and selfish choices. In 1888, the courtroom was not the only place where verdicts were rendered. The community itself acted as judge, jury, and executioner, wielding gossip and ostracism with devastating effect. The father's marriage to his son's bride may have escaped legal punishment, but socially it was condemned with relentless severity. Neighbors withdrew support, the church cast judgment, and whispers ensured that the scandal would never be forgotten. This highlights the immense power communities held in shaping lives through acceptance or rejection. While modern readers may see gossip as trivial, in rural Arkansas it was a weapon as sharp as any blade. To be cast out socially was to lose trade, friendship, and belonging. The scandal teaches us that even when the law is silent, society's collective judgment can be louder, harsher, and longer-lasting than any formal decree. Though shocking, the Arkansas scandal was not entirely unique. Forbidden unions and betrayals of trust have echoed throughout history and literature, from biblical accounts of David and Bathsheba to the tragedies penned by Shakespeare. What sets the story apart is its raw, lived reality in a small southern town at the close of the 19th century, a place where everyone knew each other and no scandal could remain hidden. It revealed timeless themes: the destructive force of unchecked desire, the collapse of trust within families, and the social consequences of transgressing moral codes. In many ways, the story stands as a cautionary tale, reminding future generations of the dangers of breaking sacred bonds. Its endurance and memory proves that some scandals transcend their era, becoming part of the larger human narrative of temptation, betrayal, and the painful cost of choices made in defiance of both love and law. The Arkansas scandal of 1888 is remembered not only because of its shocking details, but because of the way it struck at the heart of human trust. A father is supposed to be the anchor of a household, the figure who safeguards his children and prepares them for adulthood. Instead, he became the storm that destroyed everything he was meant to protect. For the son, the betrayal carved a wound deeper than any ordinary loss. It was the theft of both love and faith in family. For the bride, it sealed her identity in scandal, no matter her true feelings or intentions. And for the community, it became a cautionary tale, a whispered warning passed down as proof that even the most sacred bonds can be broken. This story endures because betrayal within a family is not easily forgotten. It haunts generations and reshapes the way we think about loyalty, duty, and the fragility of trust that at its core. The forbidden marriage reveals the collision between power and weakness. The father wielded his authority in a way that exposed the vulnerabilities of those around him. The son's devotion and obedience, qualities that should have been strengths, left him defenseless against exploitation. The bride's limited choices as a woman in her era made her susceptible to manipulation and judgment. This triangle of power and weakness shows how human relationships, when warped by desire and control, can collapse under their own weight. It is tempting to view the scandal as an isolated act of immorality, but in truth it was also a reflection of a system where patriarchal dominance could override personal will. The lesson is not only about individual failure but also about how societies that empower a single figure without balance or accountability create the very conditions in which betrayal thrives.